And welcome again to DreamWork, Pacifica Graduate Institute class. And today I am talking to author Erik Davis, who wrote many marvelous books such as Technosis and The Visionary State and a book on Zoso. He's also my spouse, but kind of nepotism. So today we're going to talk about James Hillman. This week's reading had Robert Bosnak and Robert Eisenstadt, but since recently you have seen presentations by both of these gentlemen, we're going to talk primarily about James Hillman today. Talk to me a little bit about how James Hillman fits into the Jungian world, into a Jungian context.
Sure. I think James Hillman is, without doubt, the most interesting, influential, and important thinker in the Jungian tradition, in some ways even including Jung himself. He's not quite widely read enough outside of the world of Jungian thought as he should be. In some ways I think he's one of the most significant writers on the soul and the imagination and the proper relationship to the worlds of the numinous and the imagination. And what's interesting about Hillman in a Jungian context is that he is sort of simultaneously a traditionalist of sorts and what I'd have to call a postmodern. And so it's sort of important to distinguish those. He's a traditionalist in the sense that he recognizes within Jungian thought the sort of primary intellectual or philosophical revelation of the importance of the unconscious and of the imagination as a fundamental factor in human experience as well as human thought. So it's not just about our dream life or our emotional lives, it's about our very relationship to the world and to the self is permeated with the issue of the imaginal, or the world of soul as he calls it. And he's a traditionalist in the sense that he is deeply saturated with the classics and uses classical models in the, again, typically Jungian way as models for the archetypes, models for the experience of the soul. And so in that sense, there's a great deal of allusions in his writing. And his writing is also extremely rich and full of a kind of poetic sensibility that I associate with a kind of traditional understanding, or a classical understanding of how rhetoric and imagination can be used inside writing to do something more than just ideas, more than just arguments, more than just the usual categories of non-fiction writing, either philosophical or psychological. But he's also a postmodern in some very important ways. Not that he's related directly to Derrida or to other thinkers that we would think of as being typically postmodern, but in the sense that he is relating to certain problems that I think are more contemporary inside of philosophy and in psychology. I think the main one, and this is his most significant diversion from traditional Jungian perspective, is his de-emphasis on individuation and the idea of wholeness. That in a traditional Jungian framework, the goal of individuation is often conceived as a kind of wholeness, a kind of balance, a kind of bringing together of all these different factors in this sort of great work, at the end of which is this idea of some kind of alchemical symmetry of all of these various forces inside of us. I think Hillman is more attentive and honest about the true implications of a polytheistic imagination, which is that you are in you never escape a realm of multiple centers, of tensions between, of unresolved conflicts, of unresolved dynamics, and that his ideas and his sort of model of what one is doing with this kind of work is not to lead towards a state of wholeness or a kind of singular balance, but instead to richen the dynamics, the contradictions, the brokenness in some sense that we have essentially. So there's a decentering that I think of as being very postmodern, a move away from unity towards multiplicity in its difficult and consternating as well as sort of diverse and enriching dimensions as well. There are other ways as well that I think he's postmodern, but particularly that sense of a decentered self that is never really fully present to itself and shouldn't try to be.
He talks a lot about the soul. You know, he tends to talk about, okay, well, there's the night soul and the day soul, and and he seems to find that kind of at the center of the experience that he's looking for. What does he mean by soul?
Yeah, it's a tough one in a lot of this discourse, because it comes out of some very specific traditions and ideas that if you approach it without kind of seeing the background, it's such a loose word in our culture that it can mean many different things to many different people. I think there's sort of two ways into his understanding of soul and the similar use of the term amongst related writers like Thomas More and other popularizers of this idea, as well as academics. The one is to just really think about it in terms of the distinction that is made within a Neoplatonic tradition between the soul and the spirit. And this is really the key. In our modern world, we think of a body and soul. It's sort of this polarity. But really, in this more Neoplatonic tradition, it's three stages, and the stages of three is really important. And in some language, and of course people use soul to mean different things, so it gets confusing, but in the way that the modern writers use it, soul is a middle place. It's a mediating place between the body, between the physical world, the actual world that we engage with, and the spiritual world, the world of higher principles, the world of impersonal consciousness, mystical consciousness, of meditative consciousness, a lot of transpersonal states. So it's sort of like the personal realm between the transpersonal and the ordinary body, and even to some degree the ordinary ego. It's not really about egoic emotions and ideas and impulses, but sort of what lies behind those emotional ideas. So it has a great deal to do with emotion. It has a great deal to do with the imagination. It has to do kind of with the thick and juicy realm that encases our emotional bodies, not the realm of purity, of clear seeing, of transpersonal objectivity that, say, meditators seek. So within Neoplatonism, there's a way of understanding it, but one of the best metaphors I think he uses that has just that is using an image to explain itself, which is part of what the genius of this approach is using images as philosophical tools and as forms of experience, is that he makes a contrast between spirit and soul in terms of between the mountain peak and the valley. The idea of climbing the mountain is this key religious topos. We find it in many different religions. We find it in mystical traditions. We find it in theophonic traditions of Moses and such. The idea is that in climbing the mountain, we emerge from the messiness of the world and we get into a clearer and cleaner space, more solitude, more clarity, a falling away of all of that messy human realm, and instead a confrontation with the cosmos, with the principle of the vertical, with the higher self. This is a classic spiritual modality, and Hillman contrasts this with the valley of soul making, they call it, or even the valley of the shadow of death, which is the valley that we move through in our ordinary emotional lives, where we're driven by desires and anxieties and complexes, where we're haunted by dreams, we're haunted by the ghosts of our ancestors, by unrealized desires. This is the rich psychological world. This is the world of the soul. And it's the world of the valley. It's the world where you're not trying to climb out. It's where you actually live. And I think that image of the mountain and the soul and the valley really helps distinguish this path from more meditative or contemplative or mystical traditions, which often get confused because of the word soul. But they really are distinctly different paths. They relate in interesting ways, and they can feed each other. But I think it's very important to keep them distinct.
He actually talks about dreams. He's saying one of the problems is that people always take within therapy, take the meaning of dream and try to relate it to the waking self. That dream is all about the waking self. And what he's saying is he wants to go the other way, that the things from waking and the things that we dream of are actually soul-making. He's actually talking about these images as they're breaking down, we're digesting them in soul-making. What do you think that means?
Sure. I think that if we imagine this three layers of the body, the soul, this sort of psyche realm, and the spirit, that you can ask, well, what about the ego? Where does the ego fit in that? And the ego is this interesting creature that kind of can move between these realms, but it has its own story. And the ego's main driver is the idea of agency, that it's making decisions. And what is it using this agency for? Almost entirely for self-preservation. There's always this idea of utility, of usefulness. The ego is always doing things to get things, that feeds itself, that gets what it wants, that avoids what it doesn't want. And every situation is seen as a potential source of utility. Now, this very much impacts how we think about therapy or how we think about psychological health. Because in an average conventional model, obviously the idea of psychological therapy, of any kind of psychological work, is to make you feel better. But often what that means is it basically says to make the ego more comfortable, to make the ego be able to even enact its desires and plans more easily. A lot of cognitive therapy, a lot of life coaching. It's actually saying what we want to do is make your ego shining and resplendent and more able to manifest its desires, and so we're going to get that other stuff out of the way. So when you bring dreams into the context of this more conventional approach to psychological therapy, what that tends to mean is that the dream is raw material that we are using to extract a meaning that will aid the waking self, which we can think of as the ego, in its plans and possibilities. So in that sense, it's just kind of raw material. Hillman wants to say the opposite. He wants to undermine that process. He wants to undermine, in some sense, traditional or conventional ideas of therapy, and instead translate the waking self, or almost decompose the waking self and its plans and intentionality into this wider field of soul, to weave it into these archetypal forces, to these larger, more resonant, more imaginatively rich ways of engaging the multiplicity of the human self. So it's almost like turning utility on itself. So that's, you know, one of the main complaints about Hillman from a therapeutic perspective is like, this is useless for me. It's like, this is all very interesting, Mr. Hillman. I enjoy reflecting on your things, but I'm dealing with people who are coming in with real problems, and I'm not really sure what you're talking about is really going to be helpful. And in a sense, it's a legitimate critique, but he's not interested in doing that for some degree. Or rather, more positively, he believes that true healing comes through this process of stepping away from the daylight self and being able to live and affirm life in that larger realm. And it's ultimately an ethical relationship as well, and I think that's one of the most important elements of the Jungian line, is a kind of ethics of relating to the imagination, of relating to the world of dream, where it's sort of considered at the very least rude, if not actually lame or philosophically problematic, to enter into that realm with the daylight self, with the heroic ego, seeking to use the materials and the encounters and the messages you have in order to simply further the goals of the ego. I mean, obviously there's lots of realms in between where we go in for certain healing things and we get healing messages that actually do help our lives or help the lives of the people around us. That's a beautiful, wonderful thing about the unconscious, is it can give us healing messages. But I think there's a very keen emphasis on not feeding the waking ego because of the overemphasis on the waking self inside of modern culture.
Yeah, he has this great statement about how in the dream, nobody thinks that your sister is actually your sister, or your car is actually your car, but yet there's this assumption that you are actually you, that you are this sort of intact you in the dream. And what he's saying is no, it's, you know, and I guess ultimately that's kind of the goal, the understanding that you're this, also this underworld soul, in addition to sort of being what you are. It's kind of a Buddhist perspective in a way, isn't it?
You could think about it in a Buddhist way, in the sense that you have to acknowledge that all forms, all overt forms of the self are masks, and they're empty. And so that's one aspect. But I think even more important than that is, again, the postmodern emphasis on multiplicity, that there are many selves, and there's not a centering self that organizes them all. And that part of being awake and part of engaging our condition is to really acknowledge and affirm that reality, and start to learn to not try to resolve it, not to tell a story of ourselves that there actually is a single ego in control who's moving through all these selves, seeking some kind of final integration. I mean, there are obviously processes of integration where we become, but I think that Hillman would describe integration more as becoming comfortable with the movement between these different centers. You can also think about it religiously in that it's truly polytheistic. Many gods, each with their own claims, each with their own realms, with their own ways of interacting with the self. And they don't all get together. They're squabbling all the time. They're having sex, and they're fighting, and they're like banishing each other. And, you know, there's all this turmoil in the realm of the gods. And I think he really wants to emphasize the true polytheism, and not a kind of soft polytheism that all points back towards the sort of monotheism of the ego, which is, I think, a very strong tendency, because it's very frightening to really recognize that that singular self doesn't really exist, and that we're moving between these things and trying to be ethical and to be integral with a situation that is genuinely full of diversity and difference rather than unity and holism.
Well, thank you very much for taking some time to talk to my students.
All right.
Today.
Hi, guys.
Thanks.